Good afternoon. So we're going to start today's lecture. I'm here to introduce Stan Allan. My name is Daniel Talisnik. I'm one of the 6 teachers of the Arguments class here at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. Stanley Allan studied architecture at the Cooper Union School of Architecture and also holds an MArch from Princeton University. From 1999 to 2002, he taught here at Columbia University. As a matter of fact, when he took over the master's program, in which most of the present in this room are studying, the MSc in Advanced Architectural Design, he reshaped the curriculum and began to teach the signature class of the program, Metropolis. By the way, there were only 36 students in the AAD at that time. Since 2002, he's a faculty member at Princeton University, where he was the dean of the architecture school for 10 years. Regarding another aspect of his career, after working for Richard Meyer in New York and Rafael Moneo in Spain, he established his own practice, SAA/Stan Allan Architect, and his build work includes galleries, gardens, and a number of single-family houses. From 1999 to 2003, he worked in collaboration with James Corner in field operations. So, this is our second installment of our talks on books. A couple of weeks ago, we had Amale Andraos presenting on 49 Cities. Stanley Allan is here today to talk about a book he published last year, and he co-edited it with Mark McQuaid. The book stems and takes its name from the 2009 Landform Building Architecture's New Terrain Conference in Princeton University. We can see throughout Stanley Allan's trajectory a consistent attempt to grease the wheels of our discipline. As a teacher, faculty member, dean, designer, and theorist, he is constantly attempting to push the boundaries of our field. His theoretical production has added to our lexicon such concepts as field conditions and the thick 2D. And this new book will most certainly put in circulation the concept of landform building. So, welcome, Stan.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. A little strange, honestly, between the kind of eerily familiar quality of an auditorium where I spent quite a bit of time, and the PhD students from Princeton. You know, it's a weird mix. Put it that way. I also probably I have a bad habit of not completely reading emails, and I'm sure Enrique explained the course in his email, but it's really only in chatting with Enrique a minute ago that I really understood the format today. So as a consequence, the lecture is a bit project heavy. In part, that sort of reflects where my head is right now, having stepped down from the deanship and really being focused on the office. But basically, the book is bracketed between 2 collections of projects, even if you will, projects before Landform Building and projects after. And I would say that's actually essential to the way that I work and the way that I think, that the published essays and writings are always reflections on work in progress, and they always emerge out of projects and out of problems that are within the office. But of course, it's a two-way street, and that feedback loop kind of comes back and is hopefully reflected in the projects themselves. So we can talk about that in the session afterwards. I may rush a little bit so as to leave enough time, although I believe we would take 2 hours total, right? Okay, good. Well, I could just talk for 2 hours and then avoid that discussion, but I won't do that. Two things. Again, just I like the umbrella that these lectures are being presented in under as arguments. There's an important difference between an argument and a theory. A theory, you sort of debate if it's right or if it's wrong. An argument is almost by definition a point of contention, a point of conversation. And I think also the notion of arguments leaves room for multiple viewpoints. It seems to me has something to do with the T.S. Kuhn idea of a kind of research project. I may or may not agree with some of the other people who are presenting, but that's their research project. This is my research project, Landform Building. And it's not so much that one thing is right, the other thing is wrong, but rather that it has more to do with the internal consistency and logic of the individual argument. And also, it seems to me, the rhetorical strategies of argument themselves. That is to say, you lay out certain evidence in order to convince someone. So the chief argument here, beyond the title Landform Building, is this idea of a geological turn. So if you have read the introduction to the book, there's an argument that I make here that the dominant metaphor in our field over the last 20 years has been biological. And in suggesting a geological turn, it's not so much that I think we have to turn our backs on the biological. It's really more, I think the best description of this is Manuel de Landa in his book 10,000 Years of Nonlinear History, where he talks about three strata: a linguistic strata, biological strata, and a geological or a mineral strata. So that, and again, it's not accidental, it's a geological metaphor to introduce the notion, but the idea that strata are layered and you can move back and forth between those layers. So it's not a question of giving up the biological for the geological, but rather shifting our attention to another one of those strata. So maybe simply just to scroll through some of these early projects and as context for the emergence of this work. The one thing that I will say about these projects, this is our house in Sagaponack from 2008, is this was coming off of the experience with landscape urbanism and the attention to the vertical, the kind of iconic presence of the building on the landscape, as opposed to seeing the building as an extension of the landscape, that was very important. This is a house that was unbuilt house in the Philippines that was on a very steep site. You'd enter high. We created this intermediate level. And again, this kind of profile as you looked from the street was very, very important. Small office building that we did in Korea. And again, presenting this building in this context, you could almost see this almost as a process of erosion down to the final form of the building. One of the things we try and do is not to, especially in an urban context, not to enter at the perimeter of the building, but to bring people into the center of the building before you actually enter. So, for example, here you entered off the street this way from the courtyard here, and everyone came together absolutely at the center of the building. It occurred to me as I was walking over here that Mitchell Jurgala building may be the source of my fascination with this kind of eroded staircase here. That I used to walk by that every day, and that is one of the ways in which, again, a kind of erosion from the bottom up, where the heavy base gives way to the lightweight glass, and then the patterning of the color up here. This is a small chapel that we did also in the Philippines. There's something nice about this building, which is that it's really less of a building and more of a pavilion. It has no glass in the windows. It has no air conditioning. And so in that sense, again, it has something of the quality of a piece of landscape. It doesn't have that strong sense of separation from the inside to the outside. The chapel is actually for a kind of orphanage, and it creates the kind of gateway to the campus, which is here, so it functions as a kind of marker of that entry. And one of the things that was very important, because many of the children are disabled, was again to really minimize the difference between inside and outside. So it's a single line, really, which is bent back on itself. It's kinked for seismic resistance, loops back on itself, and creates the vestry by turning back on itself, and then leaves these very large openings here. And the paving on the inside is exactly the same as the paving on the outside. When it rains, the rain comes right in, you sweep the water out, so the interior has the feel of being continuous with the exterior. And then the light is always brought in indirectly, working with the thickness of the walls to kind of filter and break the light, as I think is appropriate in the kind of tropical climate for that building. So now this work with smaller scale public buildings was taking place at the same time as we continued to develop the work that had initially had its start in the collaborative work that I did with Jim Corner, late 90s and early 2000s. And I'm only going to show one of these projects, maybe really very quickly, in part to establish the context out of which the arguments around landform building emerged. Because it's really impossible to talk about landform building without talking about landscape urbanism, and that relationship of both dependence and difference between landscape urbanism and landscape architecture. Landscape urbanism and landform building. This was a master plan for an abandoned municipal airport in the city of Taichung, an hour south of Taipei on the high-speed railway. You can see the historic center of the city here. It grew radially. The old airport was subsumed by the city. They moved out to a new one, leaving a 240-hectare site, about as close as you could possibly get to a tabula rasa in the present day. Now, part of the I'm not going to go into detail on the project, but part of the logic here was strategic, that we knew that the city could control two things. They could control infrastructure and open space. The city couldn't really control the built space. So basically, our attention went primarily into the design of the roadways in the park with the idea that the city would grow in to define that figure over time. And that would give the project an intrinsic flexibility depending on what happened over the possibly 10, 20, 15 or 20 year period of realization. Now, at the northern end of the site, there are a series of large-scale architectural pieces that create a kind of gateway and utilize, again, almost more of an infrastructural language, but that basic separation between it coming off of this famous, actually, quote by Rem Koolhaas, that you can't control the built, you can only control the void. And as I said, that means that the city that grows in can only be loosely controlled, and in fact it's controlled through more conventional strategies such as typologies and design guidelines and so on. This is that piece, infrastructural piece at the northern end, which forms a kind of gateway which is visible from the highway as it goes by. Now, this was a kind of, I think, a kind of key project that took place right around the time of the Landform Building Conference, which is that the nature and, frankly, by the way, the frustration of these large-scale urban projects is this very long-term horizon of implementation. Minimum 10, possibly 15, even 20 years for this entire piece of the city to be built out. So we convinced the mayor that he ought to build something quick that would bring people onto the site, increase awareness of the project. They found some money, they approved the project, we started some sketches for a freestanding building. One of those instances where not having a lot of budget worked in our favor. Too expensive to build a freestanding building. It's an abandoned airport. There was a nice hangar that was available. You get a sense of the scale from the tennis court. It has a strong concrete slab because they drove aircraft in, has very high ceilings, so you save on foundations, you save on the roof, and frankly for us, this idea that if it's a temporary building, it has to make its temporary quality thematic, and coupled with, let's say, the sort of cultural resonances of bamboo in Asia, led us to this notion of the temporary bamboo pavilion inside the hangar. So this idea that we basically create a dense bamboo forest, and we carve out an exhibition platform within that, and the structure uses the conventions of bamboo scaffolding that, of course, you see all over Asian cities, and then we create a kind of skin on top of the bamboo scaffolding, anywhere from 75 centimeters to 3 meters of bamboo that densely wrap this thing. So you have that sense of kind of density and thickness. Turns out that for legal reasons, we needed to have a steel structure which supports the exhibition platform, and there you see that dense weave of bamboo that encircles the steel structure. That's the lower level plan. It was photographed last year by Iwan Ban. He's always very good at showing the use of the space. You come up to the second floor. Again, that notion in the detailing language, we would make thematic the fact that it was a temporary building. Upper level is a very large set of kind of bleacher steps for events and performances, used a lot with school groups and so on. You see the way it kind of fades into the existing ceiling, and then even though it's quite a large-scale piece, the bamboo has this rather intimate quality. This guy thinks it's interesting, at least. So, shortly after we finished this, we were invited to do something at the Chengdu Biennial, and we basically built a very small version of it. With biennial pavilions, one of the things that always bothers me is the uninhabited quality of these things, that they potentially become kind of big sculptural objects. So we wanted our pavilion to be inhabited, so we created an aviary, and native bird species lived in the pavilion over the course of the time that it was up for the biennial. All right, well, so let me briefly lay out the context of landscape urbanism. And these projects essentially give you the sense of the design work that was happening in the office at the time that these ideas about landform building were kind of cooking out of the stew of landscape urbanism. Couple of, well, I don't want to, we can get into some of this later. Landscape urbanism is quite interesting because it really did emerge from the schools. Landscape urbanism came out of conferences, competitions, books, and essays before there were really a kind of collection of practitioners of landscape urbanism. And a consequence, of course, there's a very complete literature of landscape urbanism. So it's an interesting instance, I think, of the theory-practice relationship and that back and forth between speculative work, written work, and work in the field. Now, landscape urbanism, in a sense, emerges out of the dilemma posed by these two pictures. On the left, of course, is Central Park, Olmsted's brilliant 19th century intervention into the fabric of Manhattan, which clearly everyone will admit is absolutely fundamental and structural to the experience of the city today. Here's an instance in which the landscaped void has become absolutely thematic to the structure of the city around it. Now, by the 1980s, landscape architects were kind of reduced to this kind of thing. I don't want to beat up on Martha Schwartz, but the notion that the job of the landscape architect is to kind of put some green in front of a banal office building. Now, this project is even more interesting, I think, because this replaced this. And specifically, landscape architecture then is called in to play this mediating role in the place of a work of art that was seen to be too hostile and aggressive. For those of you who don't know, this is Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, which occupied the plaza in front of the Federal Building in downtown Manhattan. Was removed, Craig, when was it removed? Very good. So, I knew Craig would know that. It always amazed me that people sign petitions against the Richard Serra, but they work in this office building every day. So, but in any event, this is a kind of dilemma. If you're an ambitious young landscape architect, the last thing you want to do is to decorate plazas in front of banal office buildings. You really want to find a strategy to have some kind of real impact on the city, and also on the city as it existed at that time, late 20th, early 21st century city. The very specific issues of what one of the consultants we worked with calls the retreat of the industrial glacier, which is leaving vast empty areas in American cities. Landscape urbanism, I would argue, is a specifically American phenomenon. It's particularly well suited to the extended horizontal field of the American city, a field which, on the one hand, is made possible by embedded infrastructural systems, the interstate highway system that makes the spread out field of Los Angeles possible, but it's also porous to nature. This particular version of the American city. So landscape urbanism's focus on the presence of green space and nature as a kind of structuring element within the city, I think became very, very important. Andreas Gursky's photograph of Los Angeles there. Now, this also coincided, and this actually probably does bring a kind of Columbia history from the 1990s to bear. It coincided with a period in which architects were becoming fascinated by complex curvilinear surfaces. And I would simply suggest that there's a kind of visual fascination. Frank Gehry's Vitra Museum was like 1989, so it was right at the beginning of that period in the 1990s. And somewhere I have some computer surfaces. But I would also argue that the landscape urbanism surface was an important counter to the use of the proliferation of curvilinear surfaces in the early computer work in the 1990s. That is to say, in the landscape context, the surfaces are always performative and they have density and materiality. So, but of course, there is a similar preoccupation with a kind of language of curvilinear form. So I think that you could say that a certain generation of architects were fascinated by let's say, the expressive potential of curvilinear form, and then another generation looked at that through the lens of performance and diagrams. This is a still from a geologist up at MIT called Taylor Perron, who basically writes scripts that simulate geological processes of evolution. So clearly a key project from that period that, in a sense, synthesized the architectural preoccupation with surfaces and the landscape interest in surfaces was the FOA Yokohama Port Terminal competition from about 1995, finished in 2001. And Yokohama is, of course, nothing more than a piece of built landscape. And it's specifically using landscape strategies, warped and folded surfaces, to comply with a kind of infrastructural mandate for the port terminal. Now, there were also attempts to take that language, which, well, again, I could keep going forever, but in those early years at Columbia in the 1990s, Mark will remember this, there were a lot of studio projects for parking garages. There's a limited number of programs that a single surface can effectively deal with. And I think you begin to see that in these two examples. Now, MVRDV's Villa VPRO is actually more or less same time period as Yokohama, around 95, finished a little earlier. And part of the premise of the Villa VPRO is that you create a series of landscape-like surfaces within the depth of a very large office building. It's a kind of creative company, and that people will adapt the building to this sort of emergent social ecology of work in the space. So there's a very explicit kind of landscape analogy operating within an architectural context there. Similarly with Diller Scofidio's, I don't know if it was Diller Scofidio Renfro by that time, but their I-beam competition, where there was an attempt to take the smooth connective properties of the single surface and fold them up into something that worked in a kind of dense urban context and had the vertical kind of iconic quality. It would be easy to collect many other examples, but this is somehow a kind of definitive one. So all of these speculations, by the late 1990s, the term landscape urbanism first appeared in 1998, coined by Charles Waldheim with credit to Jim Corner, really coalesced around what I would describe as 5 working concepts. First of all, the ambition towards the infrastructural scale, not to be satisfied with landscape architecture playing a kind of marginal role, but in fact to use, in some sense you could say that they capitalized on the marginal status of landscape architecture, even what Deleuze and Guattari would call its status as a minor discipline, to make it a kind of synthetic discipline that could operate among all of the other disciplines. So ambition to the infrastructural scale, attention to surface and pattern. I've talked a little bit about the notion of program and event, that landscape architecture offers a kind of model for indeterminate open-ended programming. The notion of change over time in landscapes, and of course, anytime you're talking about landscape, the tension between the natural and the artificial. To take those, in a sense, in reverse order, there's, of course, a long history of this fraught relationship between nature and culture, even a pristine landscape like this in the late 19th century when the untouched nature of the West, of course, is framed by the gaze of the photographer, by the machinery of photography itself. So that notion of there being a kind of untamed, pristine nature out there really becomes a kind of myth. And of course, the corollary to that, around the same time, Central Park is we think of it as a piece of nature, but it's a piece of civil engineering, basically. It's a completely constructed landscape. This is Central Park under construction. It simply uses different techniques. The landscape, I think, one of the most important lessons in landscape for architects is this notion of change. Now, of course, there's the kind of obvious things like the daily change or seasonal change. This is the Asplin and Leverance Woodland Cemetery, which I actually visited for the first time last year. It's really extraordinary landscape. But I think more significantly, the ecological processes of succession as a model for change in architecture and urbanism. Central Park, just to continue to use that example, has a yearly maintenance budget of $150,000 per acre. $150,000 a year per acre to basically maintain it in a steady state. Now, a lot of ambitious and interesting young architects said, well, what if instead of maintaining our landscapes in a steady state, you actually trigger process of change and succession in a landscape? And that the city, too, changes over time in processes that have a kind of parallel to ecology and evolution. This notion, again, that the extended horizontal surface is a kind of privileged territory for open-ended, indeterminate programming that can be steered in certain directions but not scripted directly. And then finally, again, to reiterate that notion of the surface as a kind of performative entity. Jim Corner used to say, I suppose he still does say, that you need to look at the landscape through the eyes of a farmer. So that just as a farmer intuitively knows where the wet areas are, how the different sun exposures will affect the way that the landscape supports life, we can start thinking in similar kind of terms. So that in one of the first project that Jim and I did together, that we very consciously kind of sculpted the landscape to create those kind of performative surface conditions. And again, to bring it back to architecture, again, right around that time, projects that came very much out of the kind of Columbia context of the 1990s. This is Reiser Umemoto's West Side project from about 97, 98. And again, you see that, if you will, almost kind of agricultural furrows brought up to the scale of a large piece of urban infrastructure, and then reflected again at a much smaller scale 10 years later in the High Line. So again, the kind of circle kind of closes there. And finally, to mention that infrastructural scale, the notion of seeing the city in terms of speeds of movement, pockets of stasis, the analogy between that and large-scale network systems, and of course the way in which infrastructure works in a networked fashion as well. I would argue, and again, this is a question of kind of setting the stage for the landform building material, but I think to go back to that notion that beginning around 1998, you had conferences, you had books, you had competition projects, you had speculative projects, all around the theme of landscape urbanism. By 10, 12 years later, I think you have two definitive built projects in landscape urbanism, one of which is the High Line. You're all very familiar with that. And Manfredi and Weiss's Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle, both of which work with pieces of infrastructure, both of which have had a very strong effect on the urban context surrounding them. Manfredi Weiss kind of reconnecting people to the waterfront. You see the train line here. You see the highways here. And again, using very specific language of warped and folded surfaces to accomplish those series of connections. All right, so that's essentially what got me to the speculations around landform building and the conference that took place at Columbia. It's already happening at Princeton in 2009, and you can see the people who were involved in that original conference, and then was developed over the course of 2 years as a kind of freestanding book. The book was by no means a kind of snapshot of the conference. Certain people were left out, certain people were added. And one of the things I think that was important to do was to create a kind of conceptual structure for the work that's in the book. I would describe the book in many ways as a kind of curatorial project, that we needed a kind of working structure, conceptual structure, that would allow us to present a series of projects, art projects, historical projects, contemporary projects. All the projects we featured were from the 21st century, so our cutoff date was 2000. And here you can see that mutual, that relationship of dependency on the one hand, but also moving beyond landscape urbanism and landform building. So the infrastructural scale gets translated as the notion of the megaform, questions of surface, the preoccupation with connectivity, indeterminate program, process and change, and then really just simply mirroring the question of the natural and the artificial. So we have 4 working categories. One which really, look, this is a book with the word building and the word form in the title, so we're not shying away from form here. So the first one really does look at those projects where the building mimics natural form. The second one looks at the problem of scale. The fourth looks these are actually out of order, the notion of the vast interior and the interest in atmosphere, and finally the question of fabricating terrain. So I would say very, very briefly there were sort of three motivations to look at landform building as this kind of curatorial project. The first was just very simply the proliferation of landform projects in contemporary practice. I mean, these are a few, but I could easily show you 100 projects, and it almost became a cliche, the kind of softly rounded mound, and of course the desire to integrate the building with the landscape, with green roofs. You see the very literal mimicking of the form in this Toyo Ito project here. These are all quite familiar. I think you know Amid 09's Mountain of Roses for Iowa. The second motivation, again, is this larger question of the geological turn, that the preoccupation with the biological took two forms. On the one hand, there was the appeal to ecologies, to change, emergence, and process. And certainly this is something which continues to interest me, but in my mind operates much more at the scale of the city than it does at the individual building. And then, of course, the best developed theory of biomorphic form, of course, comes from Greg Lynn. It's not accidental. His book is called Animate Form, where basically jumping off from the theories of Darcy Wentworth Thompson and his famous dictum that form is a diagram of forces, he has used the digital capacities of modeling and form generation, not to mimic natural form. I think this is important. It's actually, this is again where I think he can claim to be biological as opposed to biomorphic. He's not simply imitating natural form. His claim is that he's imitating the processes of natural form generation. So again, we can talk about that. So again, my counter proposition is that we shift our attention slightly to the geological and even borrowing, as we did in the book, the geomorphic language of process, so that we created a graphic index where these operations from geology, from landform building as a verb, were borrowed to categorize some of the projects that we showed in the book. And then thirdly, to rewrite the kind of genealogy, in particular going back to projects typically from the 1960s, Jean Renaudie, these terraced apartments in Paris, to maybe look at some overlooked sources and write a kind of longer genealogy of landform building. All right, well, I'm going to sort of assume that people are familiar with the book, and let's say maybe having given that introduction, I won't go into too much detail here in these, just sort of quickly running through these four categories. This is Gottfried Bohm's Church, Moneo's Kursaal, Monsieur Tugnon's Museum of Immigration in Algeciras, which is of course very closely related to a project of theirs where these forms were very specifically mimicking the forms of the mountain. It was interesting as we were putting the book together, Mazzanti's library in Medellin, and he really does talk about this as a piece of geology. And I think in part, the notion that in this incredibly tough environment, social environment that the building occupies, the resistance of the geological as a kind of a kind of tough response to that neighborhood that then would, in a sense, kind of create a new platform for the social life of the neighborhood becomes a kind of important question. A series of curated contributions from artists, including a series of found photographs from Tacita Dean. So all of these were either postcards or photographs, which she found in flea markets in Berlin. She was, of course, she thinks in series, so the order was very important. And I think another thing which for me comes out of these is a kind of formlessness to the language of accumulation in the ice, ice and snow. As we thought about the large scale, the very important point of reference was Kenneth Frampton's 1999 essay, Megaform as Urban Landscape. And that essay was out of print at the time, and so we reprinted the essay. Frampton's megaform is a conscious response to the megastructure. You could see this famous Hans Hollein collage of the aircraft carrier in the landscape. Here, you have a very strong contrast between a technological object inserted into a natural landscape. And part of the claim of the megaform is that you can deploy that large scale, but through organizational and design devices that in particular tend to work in section, you can kind of mediate that relationship between the very large-scale object and its context. And I think Stephen Hull's Vanke Center is probably one of the best examples of that. This is a building that is as long as the Chrysler Building is tall, laid down on the landscape. And of course, part of the claim of the project is that in this particular, between the sort of mountains and the sea here, to accommodate the program in a series of towers would have created a kind of barrier, whereas the building itself creates this kind of open landscape field with horizontal connections that allow a kind of transparency. Dominique Perrault's negative landform in Seoul, and a competition project of ours, a 3.5 meter long structure that spanned between these two artificial lakes. So a strong piece of structure, but a piece of structure that adjusts to the local conditions of the landscape as it moves across this very large site. These photomontages from the 1970s, again, really playing with a kind of extreme relationship between nature and the city, almost a kind of apocalyptic relationship between nature and the city, again suggesting that the natural world and the city are not so completely separated. Pre-photomontage, by the way, done in the 1970s, all with photographic material. The notion of the vast interior, I think, became very important to us for two reasons, really. The first is that the idea that we could think of the landform as something experiential, not something you looked at. One of the characteristics of landscapes is that you don't look at a landscape. Landscape surrounds you. Landscape is an immersive phenomenon. So this helped us get away from the kind of object-based notion of landscape. And it also, quite frankly, is very much an experience of the contemporary city. The large interlinked artificial interiors, or in a kind of architectural context, interiors that are so large that they take on the quality of an exterior space. One of my favorite buildings, Villanova Artigas's architecture faculty in Sao Paulo, and of course taken during the student protests of the 1970s. So you really do see this piece of architecture functioning like a kind of public plaza, public space. And of course the architect's fascination with the atmospheric, from Diller Scofidio again to Philippe Rahm, and the notion that if we have a kind of expanded notion of landform, Well, the vast open field of the desert is also a form. We again published an out-of-print chapter from Rainer Banham's Scenes from American Deserta. Sejim Nishizawa, obviously, with their preoccupation with constructed atmospheric spaces, and Ishigami's library, the experience of which is a bit, again, it's a kind of immersive experience of moving through the kind of the forest interior as forest. And then Nishizawa's museum for Rei Naito, the sculptor, it's a private museum for a sculptor. These are her works, by the way. But again, this notion that you could create a kind of exhibition space that was sort of boundless as a kind of counterpoint to her very delicately scaled works. And I was fascinated by the photographs of Walter Niedermeyer. If traditional landscape painting and photography is always dependent on a horizon, working in this kind of alpine landscape, that horizon is tipped up to create a kind of layered picture plane, and of course always the kind of equal co-presence of the built and the natural and the artificial, and of course the kind of the whiteness of the snow as this kind of indeterminate space, which I was fascinated with. Okay, and then finally, the last chapter, I thought it was very important in this particular context not to make the landscape architecture connection too facile. Again, landscape architects would be annoyed with this comment, but it's sort of easy to pile up dirt and to shape a landscape. You just get enough bulldozers and you can shape a landscape. Well, to build those forms in hard resistant materials is difficult and involves a particular set of design, very, very specific design and technical challenges. So for example, a project that Nader Tarani presented at the original conference for this large complex in Kuwait, unbuilt, where the landform is interestingly enough is in the roof, it's not in the floor. And it's a continuous coffered ceiling, but the geometry of the coffers adjust to each of the programs over the course of this extended kind of field. So again, there's a kind of architectural intelligence that's very precise and working again enabled by digital tools that takes some of the variation and the continuity that we associate with landscape and incorporates it into an architectural scale. And of course, Sana's EPFL is an important point of reference here. But again, we wanted to present this building in a way that it hadn't been presented. So rather than the kind of usual photographs that the architects publish, we went to the engineers and to the fabrication consultants, to Fabian Schurer and Design to Production, who did all of the form work for the building, and to Bollinger and Groman, the engineers, so that you see the technological infrastructure in a way necessary to create the kind of smooth landscape forms, or to show the building under construction, we showed some work of a geologist from Princeton who works with digital visualizers, and then a friend of mine who runs a program called Land Arts of the American West that did this digital scan of Michael Heiser's double negative. You can see their equipment set up here. I'm going to go really, really fast through 3 projects, and I'm going to show one project a little bit more detail so we can leave time for discussion. How does that sound? And we can talk about this. Because again, what preceded all of this, in a way, and again, it's Columbia University history, is my own interest in field conditions. That's the Swedish translation. Again, we can maybe get into this in the discussion, but the proposition of field conditions is that you create difference by the accumulation of small scale differences among a field of elements that are roughly similar. So it's a production of difference, if you will, from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And there are, of course, good architectural examples, Melnikov and Le Corbusier, and then the diagram is also important in here, and we talk about that. Okay. This I'm not going to show in detail, but this is a project where that field conditions notion kind of returned as a strategy to deal with a particular competition brief. This was an art museum for the city of Maribor in Slovenia, beautifully preserved Eastern European city. And really the dilemma of the project was this, that the competition brief called for a very singular, very progressive, highly identifiable icon for the new museum, yet we were working in this beautifully preserved context. So our strategy was that what gives a city like this its quality, its texture, it's not so much the specifics of the roof pitches and the materials and so on, but it's the fact that the city has grown over time with the accumulation of fairly small pieces that follow more or less the same rules as they are aggregated. So that sort of part-to-whole aggregation strategy became a way to both create the new image of the museum, at the same time respecting the kind of grain of that existing city through a repeated kind of strategy of aggregation. There was also a programmatic dimension to that, as is quite typical in museums, there were large-scale public programs, yet the galleries themselves also need a certain modularity, a certain rhythm to create the kind of curatorial narrative. So non-centralized expansive systems capable of becoming specific at each point, which was a phrase that Emilio Toñón and Luis Mencía used at one point. These are some very early sketches about those sort of part whole, something that Ed Eigen sent me, speciation. I mean, this is the Linnaean diagram, right? I mean, basically arbitrary boundaries within a continuous field. Here you create archipelagos that don't interact. And obviously the two interesting ones are these, where you both have specific spaces and locations, yet everything is interconnected. And this sketch was what inspired Ed to send me this, so obviously that was very much in the thinking. So the key thing here is using those sort of part-to-whole strategies of aggregation here with a series of units, each of which have an identical plan that, as they're put together, both make a kind of identifiable whole as the kind of image of the institution, yet you can trace back the individual piece and use that to create that relationship without a kind of contextual mimesis, so that it fits into the existing city without a huge jump of scale. So I'm just going to scroll through those. Each one is lifted up. You can see the plan is identical. They're all pentagons, and then together they make a kind of continuous lattice. This is the way they're lifted up. Galleries above there, lower level, entry, the galleries where you have the kind of very active skylights, and then a smaller scale up above. Okay, so there's a logic to the strategy of aggregation in the Maribor project. The next competition we did was for an opera house. If there's anything less field-like, it's an opera house. Opera is all about focused, concentrated attention, spectacle, excess, and so on. So it seemed an interesting exercise to see if we could use the kind of aggregation strategy here. Also, it had to do with, this is the kind of strange thing that, comes up in contemporary practice. Busan in South Korea is an industrial port which is trying to convert into more of a kind of leisure and spectacle entertainment. So all of this is being filled. We are not responsible for that kidney-shaped island, and they are putting the Opera House out here with obvious references to the Sydney Opera House. Interesting exercise. Google Opera House today, go to images. More than 90 out of the 100 images that come up are the Sydney Opera House. It's really pretty extraordinary, actually, the extent to which that has become the image of the Opera House. So clearly they wanted an icon. Our working metaphor, again, these are the post-landform building projects, was this notion from geology. An erratic is basically a rock that's in the wrong place, brought there by a glacier, by erosion, or something like that. So our idea that we're working between the mountain, the city, and the sea, it's like a piece of the mountain migrated out here between the city and the sea. So again, I'm not going to, just the contextual things here. Of course, the other iconic opera house is Beirut. We liked this little Monopoly house here, and we realized that Monopoly house, you turn it on its side, it's a pentagon. So that became our kind of working piece here. You start aggregating these pieces. At a certain point, you get a larger piece that accommodates the auditorium, all of the kind of back of house stuff. And this was our basic working plan diagram and early study model. Now, each of those Monopoly houses on its side are pulled and stretched, and then there's a secondary operation where it's duplicated, rotated 90 degrees, which allows us to occupy the middle zone of the project like this. So again, this notion that individual pieces come together to make, in this case, a whole where the parts are less identifiable, but they are still present. So this assembly of our working sketch model, you can see the separateness, the individuality of those pieces, and this operation of twisting that creates those higher up voids, yet the artifact that results doesn't necessarily register that part to whole relationship in such an explicit way. The other point here is simply that the complex whole that results here is a reflection of the complexity of the program itself. The foyer, and then at the upper level, these occupiable spaces that allow you to look back at the sea or the city. Now, we didn't win that competition, which is always a little frustrating. But we're building a piece of it. This is a house I built 10 years ago in upstate New York. And we are now, that's the existing house, we are now adding on to it. And you see, this is a pentagon. It's a studio for the client, and then we're using it as an opportunity to rework the landscape. But basically that pentagonal form actually turns out to ideally suit this particular artist because she works with projection. And one of the interesting things about the pentagon is it's the simplest form that is a kind of dynamic form. By adding one side to the stable form of the square, you destabilize the square, but without making it over complex. So here's this project. It's pretty much finished. We're waiting on the landscape. Okay, last project, I promise. And I told you it was a little project heavy. But again, this is. The excuse is this is the most geological of the projects. So this is a competition we just finished it was an invited competition for a monument to freedom and equality in Leipzig. They're building these in Germany, and they In this particular case, it commemorates the events of the fall of 1989 in Leipzig. The center of the city, it was bombed quite heavily in the war, and our site is immediately outside the kind of first ring. So what was at one time a very kind of coherent urban space now looks like this, kind of formless space of contemporary urbanity. Ringed, though, interestingly enough, by institutions, the Staatsbibliothek and the Neue Rathaus, but then with this piece of infrastructure running through it. So it actually leaves very little space for a kind of conventional urban response. So the events that it commemorates are, I mean, I have a passage in the field conditions piece where I talk about the crowd as a phenomena, working off of the book by Elias Canetti called Crowds and Power, which is a fascinating read if you haven't read it. So it is a collective phenomenon. The events in the fall of 1989. And the question is how to best sort of commemorate that, what kind of icon, what kind of monument is appropriate. Now, the conventional strategy of the monument from the 19th century, the singularity, the hierarchy, the iconicity of this is something we're highly suspicious of. Certainly the kind of field conditions thinking was very much against this. But I would argue, at least in this particular context, the pure field condition, which is the Eisenman Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, is also not so appropriate. That we needed, in a way, to hybridize these two languages, the iconic language and the field language. So that was our goal with this particular project. And the kind of working metaphor was that of the kind of stone yard. That between the ruin, between the kind of coherent piece that has fallen into ruin, and you can see the parts that once made up that whole, or this is Canaletto's painting called The Stone Yard, or the monument that is yet to be built from the fragments. We wanted to create a monument that had that ambiguous condition. You weren't sure that if it was something that was once built that was now falling into ruin, or something that was in the process of being constructed. This, it seemed to us, was an appropriate metaphor for this problem of the monument to freedom and unity, even, let's say, acknowledging the potential destruction and violence necessary sometimes for political change, yet at the same time optimistically looking forward to the kind of construction of the new state. So this was the given site, and in fact we could not occupy any of the territory above the subway line. And the kind of study models here, where this notion of creating a kind of village of forms, a kind of multiplicity of forms. But then how do we achieve that? We achieve that through a series of operations that belong to the history of the discipline, specifically operations of projection and stereometrics. So we start again with a pentagon. We're kind of preoccupied with that form, which is then distorted, cut, and deformed, subtracted, deformation, cutting, subtraction, and translation are the four operations here. So that in fact, it would be possible to completely reconstruct the two initial solids from all of the pieces that are on site. Yet, hopefully, we've sort of captured that moment of ambiguity between a whole that's being taken apart or some new whole that's being constructed out of those pieces. This is the plan. You can see that there's really only a very small portion of the site that's occupiable, the kind of scatter of forms, which is then related to a series of axes that pick up some of those monuments, both new and old. So here is the axonometric view of the piece being sort of taken apart, and then creating all of these opportunities. I think the other important thing about a monument today is that it really has to be experienced both as a kind of special commemorative occasion, but also as part of everyday life. So again, there's a sort of notion here that as the thing is broken down into these parts, it has this potential for different kinds of uses, for informal performances and so on. So from the city looking towards the site, we have very conventional, monumental, pyramidal kind of profile, and then again, the kind of informality of the pieces close up and local, and then from the site looking back to the city, we have a kind of field of fragments here. Sometimes you can kind of reconstruct those specific operations. These are these axes, but again, that axis is also blocked by this piece which has shifted into the axis. So here, the kind of model collaged into the existing site, future buildings proposed here and here. And again, as you come up close, of course, this kind of stony geological language is really the kind of dominant language that operates both with a kind of vertical, iconic, monumental image here, yet allows this kind of more intimate, more informal engagement with the monument itself. So that's the last image. Thank you. So I didn't quite eat up all of the time, but it was a bit more of the conventional hour-long lecture. You want me in the middle? You're going to get from both sides. Come on.
You know, the format that we following is that we begin the conversation.
Good.
We do the conversation, then we pass on.
Sure. Good.
We just have for a little bit more.
A little more, yeah.
We're going to move forward.
Yeah.
Short conversation amongst us,
Good.
and then just pass it on.
Good.
We have a full house, so it's a good opportunity.
Well, we had a full house.
Yeah,
Because it's the mix of the
Yeah.
AAD and also the architecture program that's running all through July.
Oh, okay.
So
See, so some of those kids are really young.
exciting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
We have, and it's only for the mass gallery that's today.
Yeah.
It's countryside tourism.
Yes. Right.
So it's just
Yeah.
where I want to be.
Yeah. Okay. Now we're down to the hardcore.
So I'm going to pass the word to my colleague Pep for him to start with the first question.
Okay, I'm going to begin. I've seen this presentation a few times. So, and the more I think about I'm going to ask you about the book, first, sure. Of course. The more I think about the book, the more I'm surprised about the role of technology within the book. It's almost absent except for those moments of fabrication,
Sure.
You know, where you really want to create or you are really advocating for a kind of atmospheric effect within the vast interiors you are describing.
Yeah.
But one possible answer to that kind of omission, and I mean, knowing your background, knowing that how much you are interested in issues of technology, is that for you, technologies, and perhaps that's not a coincidence that Aldo Rossi appears, the role of technology is similar as the role of typology in Aldo Rossi. It's cultural. So to some extent, it's almost impossible to define form in our current conditions without being technological. So
Yeah.
form
Yeah.
is necessarily a technological
Right.
enterprise.
Yeah.
The definition of form in itself, either in its creation, in its design, or in fabrication. And if
Yeah. No, I agree with you, and I think it's a really important point to maybe emphasize and lay out on the table for discussion. And I think it probably operates at least three different levels, from least obvious to most obvious in a way. And the first is really this notion that in this category of the atmospheric, we're trying to capture what is for me a very contemporary sensibility that belongs to technology, and it belongs to the role of technology in the city, and in the way that the experience of media and the experience of city, in a sense, are becoming more and more intertwined, and in a sense becoming kind of closer. So that in the essay that introduces that section, there's a quote by Rem Koolhaas saying that the city more and more resembles a kind of landscape, and it resembles a landscape again not because there's green there and because there are trees and planting, but it resembles a landscape because of the way we move through it, because of the way we experience it, and I would say also because of the overlay of information that arises out of the hybridization of technology and the city in the technology and architecture in the contemporary city. So that's an important point, that this notion of there being multiple natures and that being one is very important. Second point is I mean the design and the imagination of these places. You know, we simply can't disentangle the way we look and think and work today from the tools that we're working with. And then the third, the most obvious, is what's sort of laid out in the sense of the new technologies that make it possible to build these. You know, what does it take to build a landscape?
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, I would argue that there are elements of your idea of the thick 2D in the concept of buildings like landscape, and that there are elements of field condition and landscape urbanism. Mm-hmm. And then you've coined this third category that stems from the other two, which is landform building. So it's a little bit of a different situation. Sure. Because the category predates perhaps the examples. Yeah. But I wanted to ask you, is there such concept as the thick 2D or field conditions that would pair landform building?
Yeah, I mean, I think the part of the reason why I thought it was important to show those three projects that say the category of landform building that I would put the work that we're doing in is this notion of geological form. So and part of the well, I can answer your question two ways. I can answer it, let's say, in a slightly more rigorous and theoretical way. I can also answer it in a very personal way. I'll give you the sort of theoretical answer first, which is to say that in the 90s, when I first wrote the field conditions piece, and did a series of projects. Well, maybe this isn't such a rigorous answer. It's really more one emerging out of a kind of frustration in practice. Very hard to get past the map building. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that. That if you ask the question, what does field conditions in architecture give you? The simple answer is the map building, and there was this volume that Hashem Sarkis did where he looked at the Venice Hospital, which is where I wrote that piece about the thick 2D. And architecturally, at a certain point, that just became very limiting and frustrating. And so, in a sense, kind of turned my back on the field conditions stuff for a while and was engaged with landscape urbanism. And I think there was a turn, I don't know, let's say middle 2000s, maybe some people who were smarter was the early 2000s, that sort of came back to the problem of the vertical plane, the iconicity of the building, and architecture as a strategy of partitioning and dividing space, right? Again, if you go back to the 1990s, the parallel fascination by landscape architects, landscape urbanists, and architects in folded curvilinear surfaces was all about connectivity, right? That was about continuity and connectivity. And again, to go back to the media thing, there was an analogy made between digital connectivity and literal connectivity in those kind of surface projects. I think we all at a certain point became a little bit suspicious both of the sort of quasi-utopian politics of pure connectivity. Michael Hayes wrote this famous piece on the smoothing of architectural theory, that in fact discontinuity, confrontation, even boundaries and borders are actually important. And then secondly, that one of architecture's primary capacities, primary expertise actually is the creation of borders and boundaries more than the creation of pure, perfect, smooth connectivity. So I think the Maribor project is important to me because it was a question of coming back to the field condition strategies in terms of the of aggregation, but doing so with more of a recognition of the vertical plane of borders and boundaries and discontinuities, as opposed to the utopia of pure connectivity and the matte building and the thick 2D.
I'm sure there's going to be plenty of questions regarding the geological shift and all this stuff, but I wanted to ask you about something else. You mentioned that the issue of landscape urbanism is a very American discussion. I mean, Charles Walton promoting the concept, and you also mentioned that there were two foundational projects, or kind of foundational, or at least that suggest a different kind of strategy towards the city, which is the High Line and Seattle's Wise. Yeah. So, but most of the examples you have shown after that are elsewhere. And even your work is elsewhere except for the house. So I thought that the entire strategy also of reclaiming those two projects was like, raising the hand to tell the public authorities in the United States, architects are here, we are going to design. I mean, we are back to try to design the city in other terms, but in fact, it's not really taking. Is there?
Yeah, I mean, again, maybe I should have been kind of clearer about the chronology there. That, and that again was partly. I mean, look, I don't want to make too much of this, but you could also say, in some sense, I mean, if Yokohama is the definitive single surface projects. And that the High Line and Seattle Sculpture Park are the definitive built examples of landscape urbanism. I don't want to say there's no work left to be done in landscape urbanism, but I think we're past the period of the greatest innovation in landscape urbanism. I mean, I would certainly want to think that it was still possible, but in terms of, let's say, a series of sort of theoretical principles that were laid out in the early 90s, early 2000s, that are now being put into practice by the first generation of practitioners, that work has been done in a way. So part of, but at the same time, I mean, to come back to the point that that landscape urbanism as a fundamentally American phenomenon, I would actually hold to that. I know there are plenty of people who would give you counter arguments. I mean, Adrian Goeze has made very important contributions in the early work. I mean, somebody took me through the riverfront project on the western edge of Madrid. I mean, this is a piece of landscape urbanism, and it's happening in Madrid, right? You could say it's making Madrid a little bit more American almost, but
that's a good point.
But I would actually hold to the claim that landscape urbanism is. Landscape, it's not that it's an American phenomenon, it's that it's an American version of the city. And I think what you could say, in fact, is that American version of the city is actually now being imported globally. And so that's where the landscape urbanism, landform building distinction becomes important, that the landform building was specifically an attempt to come back to the agency of the compact building and the kind of agency of a piece of architecture within the city, as opposed to pure landscape strategies. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because another way
that's the important clarification that I made.
Another way of asking Pep's question is, with the rubric of land for building, you're claiming back infrastructure into the field of architecture.
Yeah.
Which is a way of saying, from the single building to the city, not from the city to the building.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, Pep. I guess I mentioned. I didn't mention Rossi in the lecture, but I do mention Rossi in the book. And yeah, I mean, again, it again maybe just kind of personal history. I mean, that was the period that I went to school, you know, and it's pretty interesting to reread Rossi's architecture in the city. It sounds pretty progressive when when he talks about persistence versus change in the city. He sounds very contemporary, actually. So it's worth, you know. So, but yeah, I mean, look, I mean, again, splitting hairs within the landscape community. I think actually part of the motivation for Landform building, in the fall of 2008, I was at a conference in Toronto, organized by a guy called Pierre Bélanger, who's now up at Harvard, on landscape infrastructure. And again, it was one of those, I didn't really read the email very carefully. And I showed up at the conference, and it was mostly landscape architects. Charles Waldheim was still teaching at Toronto at that time. He happened to be out of town. The sub-theme of that conference was, landscape urbanism is over, it's now all about landscape infrastructure. Now, that's a fairly fine distinction. I'm not quite sure that it's, but I think your description is correct, and that again partly is simply that it is an argument for reclaiming the disciplinary agency of architecture as opposed to the interdisciplinary project of landscape urbanism.
Actually, in a review of the book, Gillian Darley makes the argument that in your conference there was no landscape designers.
Only intentionally, yes,
of course.
Yes.
So it's kind of the.
Yeah. And again, the landscape architects will get pissed off at me, but my two definitive examples. I mean, Seattle Sculpture Park was designed by architects, and I'm not going to get into the battle between Diller Scofidio and field operations, but at least there were architects involved. So that's a different discussion. But I mean, the tools. I would argue the tools are essentially architectural.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we should open up the conversation to the public. Yeah. So who has the first question? Here.
Hello. I think my question is engages with what we were talking about right now, about the idea of architecture and what's the role of architecture in determining like structure and urbanization. And I think in your presentation, when you were presenting the Taiwan project, I think that actually triggered that thought in my mind, because it's although it's interesting to see how, for example, a strategy that's determined by a void starts to structure urbanization. You start to think, how is that development going to occur? And what's the role of us as architects in terms of trying to determine what are those difference and organizational specificities that we would like to implement in this new sort of urbanization without replicating those conventional like planning devices such as typology, as you mentioned. So I just wanted you to talk more about this.
I mean, the crucial piece there, and again, there is a kind of binary in that project that it's organized around a void, and and quite literally, I mean, this is certainly one of the, I think one of the real kind of accomplishments of landscape urbanism is to recognize the power of the void as a kind of structuring, that there's no such, I mean, again, you could say that this is how landscape architects think. To them, the void is not empty. There's life in the void. There's activity, there's structure, that a green open space is not unstructured, it's actually highly structured, right? And so, again, this is I think one of the great lessons from landscape architecture. So the idea that there's a kind of structured void, and that the dynamism of the city itself grows up around that void, and that also that the void can be catalytic, right? I mean, certainly Highline has shown this. And then also that it's also a question of the kind of vision of the city, right? That you don't. I mean, 240 hectares designed by a single author would be a nightmare. You want many agents involved in a fragment of the city, so it's strategic, right? How do you set up a process? It's as much, and again, this is one of the accomplishments of landscape urbanism. It's as much about setting up the process as it is about the final image of a master plan, right? I mean, the difference. But just to follow through on the question, that the binary structure of the void and then a kind of very loosely controlled urban tissue that would grow up to that is complicated by those large-scale buildings at the head of the park that function at a kind of infrastructural level. They, again, you could even say in a kind of Rossian sense, they're kind of, urban monuments. And those are pieces of architecture much more than they are the design of a void. So.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hi. So my question is regarding to the book Landform Building. I'm really interested in what you were saying in the preface that, quote, there is a simultaneous and synchronic dissolution of two types, the skyscraper and the large urban park. And also in your presentation, you mentioned the category of the book that there is a scale, which means megaform. So I'm really curious that do you think that it is the landform building is another version of architectural ambition? It's another version of architectural ambition. Yeah. Or it's a respect to nature that architecture works as landform.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, okay. Interesting. In your question, the first quotation comes from Iñaki Abalos, and I thought it was an interesting proposition that these two great modernist typologies, the urban park and the skyscraper, are no longer viable in the 21st century, and sort of where do we go from here? I mean, I think that's actually quite interesting. And then the second question about the megaform, the issue is this. I think that Frampton was very specific in offering up the megaform as a kind of counter strategy to the megastructure, and with an argument being that I think it has more to do not so much with architectural ambition, but with just simply dealing with the reality of large-scale building in the city today. That if and again this may have been more true pre-2008, but if cities are going to grow and if projects are going to acquire a certain scale, the notion that you can appeal to these series of landscape strategies in order to mediate that very large scale, and in fact for Frampton it is precisely a sectional mediation, topographic and topological, that he says can take that scale of construction which is fundamentally incompatible with the traditional structure of the city and knit it back into the city more effectively. So I think in that form of the argument it's really more about mediating the scale of the large pieces rather than exaggerating the sort of ambition of those pieces.
Hello. I was wondering, you presented the development of form through geological processes, listing a series of diagrammatic actions and presenting past dialectical oppositions like nature versus the artifice. And I was wondering, as we enter a new phase of geology, the Anthropocene, should we look beyond known geological processes and these oppositions of nature versus artifice? Maybe is there an addendum to the book and some evolution of building form?
Well, if there is, it's probably written by somebody with a better knowledge of geology than me. But I think, I mean, there's an important point to be made about this geological turn, that it could be read, I mean, as a, and especially, you know, with the references, let's say, to Waldo Rossi and so on, as simply an appeal to architecture's essential mineral character, right? That architecture is the hard substrate, and life, event, and program is the kind of biological overlay. I would resist that reading, which would tend to see the geological turn as a turn back to some sort of essentially static, solid, resistant character of the architecture. And I think this relevant in your evocation of, I don't know if this is a familiar term, is many geologists argue that we need a new designation for the period that we're in, and they propose this notion of the Anthropocene. I'm not quite sure when they say it started, in sometimes in the Industrial Revolution, but essentially the scale of man-made intervention on the geological substrate has reached the point where it needs to be recognized with a new geological era, hence the Anthropocene. And the implication in that term that you could say in some sense that the biological and the geological are inseparably woven together and linked up. And so I would argue at least that to suggest a geological turn is not simply to sort of go back and appeal to the hard, resistant character of architecture as the stable backdrop to life, but to recognize that the main difference between the biological and the geological is simply one of speed. That biological life changes and adapts much, much faster, but the geology also changes. It just changes more slowly. And that somehow that slower speed of change seems like a more productive, for me at least, a more productive way of thinking about architecture. I mean, again, just Columbia history. We used to talk about the stopping problem, right? That the kind of the Maya animations, or even before that, soft image animations that were used to generate form in the studios upstairs at Columbia. The question was always, where did you stop, right? And Greg Lynn's answer was, well, you stop when it looks good, which is probably a pretty good answer, by the way. But that notion that in the Greg Lynn project, you're not actually looking at animate form, you're looking at snapshots of animate form. And so, in part, by appealing to the slower speed of change and these geological operations, it's recognizing again that kind of slowness.
So my question is pretty general, but I think it's important for any architecture or ideas of architecture. So what do you think landform buildings do to the development of cities, and why is it so important?
Yeah, again, I think I'll give you a general answer to a general question, which is that I think the great challenge of the 21st century is to reintegrate nature into the city, but I think we have to do that in a way that's, again, is not the kind of cliched way that simply planting more trees and having more green. So we need sophisticated ways of thinking about the way that the city of the future will be some kind of hybrid of nature and culture.
But how far the boundary of architecture and landscape the nature can be pushed?
Well, again, I think that requires thinking about nature and thinking about landscape, not always in terms of let's say green and I mean, look, we're all probably rightly sort of suspicious of all the preoccupation with sustainability and so on, but again, I think it's a, it's something that if nothing else, it's simply a reality of practice today that we have to be thinking in those terms. So again, it has to do with the recognition of the fundamental artificiality of architecture. But even today, at least in the Western world, of basically the artificiality of nature as well. And I mean, I think there's an important, I mean, look, this is, could potentially be another digression, right? But I mean, if you take a slightly longer historical view, I mean, I think the La Villette competition in 1983 is a very important sort of prehistory for landscape urbanism. Again, not accidentally, the two key projects, the OMA and the Schumi project, both are both projects by architects. But 1983, there's the claim of the more innovative projects of the La Villette competition was for the constructed nature, the constructed quality of nature, and the artificiality of the urban park, making landscape more like architecture, right? Now, by the late, and again, it's interesting, for me at least, the pair to La Villette is the Downsview competition in 1999-2000, where, again, interestingly enough, Kohlhaas and Schumi are paired again. And I would argue that in Downsview, the issue is not so much using culture as a lens to view nature, but now using nature as a lens to view culture. Thinking about things like biotechnology and biopolitics, genetic engineering, and so on. That these are the new. Now, when you talk about genetic engineering, you're working with nature, but you're working entirely within a kind of artificial environment. So that line, and many people have written very much more sophisticated terms about these issues than I have, but it's simply to say that the line between natural and artificial today is almost impossible to fix.
Just to pick up on the question about cities, which I think is a really important one. I mean, the trajectory you just traced out, in some senses, also corresponds with, let's say, the separation of architecture from urban planning departments in the 70s, right?
Yeah.
Two disciplines that used to be very closely linked begin to go in separate directions. And it's almost like architecture has come back to the city in some ways via landscape urbanism.
Sure, no,
right?
absolutely.
And I'm wondering, with the proposition of the geological analogy, does architecture get to think about the city in urban terms still, or is it somehow mediating its thought about the city through a kind of natural analogy? Like, what is the status of urban history and the theories of the city within a geological model, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I haven't thought it through entirely. I mean, to address the first part of it, I think that's absolutely true, and it was very strategic on the part of the early thinking around the landscape urbanism, that not only had landscape architects been marginalized from being able to intervene in the city. I mean, frankly, architects had as well, because you in the institutional change that you mentioned, the separation of planning and architecture, and what was meant to fill the void but never was able to do it effectively was urban design, right? And again, urban design operating through tools of typology and morphology and figure ground planning and so on. And that again, there was a sense that those tools had exhausted themselves and proven to be rather ineffectual, especially, again, I would argue, when faced with a city like Los Angeles, or when faced with the disintegration of the social fabric of a city like Detroit. I mean, figure ground diagrams are just simply not going to help you much in Detroit, right? Again, I want to recognize the importance of the theoretical claims of landscape urbanism. I mean, I think that and it's not accidental that, some of Charles Waldheim's early stuff was precisely around Detroit, right? Essentially that there were a series of problems of real on-the-ground social planning, architecture, and design problems that the conventional tools of urban design were simply ill-suited to deal with. We did some work in Cleveland, and again, the vast kind of empty areas that were left when the industry left, and so on. So we needed a new set of tools, and this was the accomplishment of landscape urbanism, to step up and say, you need a kind of synthetic approach that the landscape architect can bring together: civil engineering, ecology, architecture, in a productive way, and produce a kind of produce a new set of tools for working effectively within the city. Now, I think the fault does not lie with the theory. The fault lies probably more at the institutional level and with commissioning agencies. That with the exception of a couple of, I think, the examples that I mentioned, but even those, the projects of landscape urbanism are basically large-scale urban parks. The urbanism part of landscape urbanism, that ambition hasn't actually been realized. So I think partly the turn back to a more architectural scale of working implied in landform building was a recognition of that fact. Now, whether it's the answer to that problem, I'm not sure I would go that far. And I think partly it is precisely, I think if you work within the contemporary city, you can never entirely, I would argue, leave behind some of these questions, let's say, of typology and so on. So what exactly the kind of tension would be between, say, landform building and typology? The Mazzanti Library, for example, has absolutely nothing to do with conventional typologies of a library. And so that's an interesting question. Is it an effective urban intervention? Is its effectiveness have more to do with the programs that the mayor of Medellin put into place? Or can you trace it back to very specific formal organizational and design moves in the project? I don't know the answer to that, but in that particular example, you could almost say it's an anti-typological project, but it's been quite successful in its social and kind of urban context.
Yeah. We had a specialistic movement in Europe. And all these ideas we have had in the 20s.
Yeah. That's part of the project of the landform building book was to suggest, yes, there is a longer history to these things.
But the difference would be that the expressionists were placing buildings on top of either crystal formations or hills, and the Mazzanti Library.
Sure.
It's really the crossing with of the mountain and the skyscraper or something of the likes.
Yeah.
Can I throw in one question? Oh, okay, no.
Yeah.
I'm informed that no.
Sorry, I actually want to pull back a couple steps to the more framework question and ask about the role and relationship of evolutionary thought to landform as an approach, and also not just the sort of evolution that like Greg Lynn was doing using those processes, but thinking more about the potential for a synthetic response where we're looking at the kind of relationships that are described between environments and organisms.
Sure.
And sort of that broader resource-based.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, the progressive ecologists will tell you that all ecology is coevolution. And there's another, I think it's Gregory Bateson says, there is an ecology of bad ideas just as there's an ecology of weeds. So, the thing about ecology is, in ecology and its relationship to environmentalism, it seems like it's everything is happy and warm in the world of ecology, but in fact, ecology is indifferent. And that Bateson quotation captures that really quite well. So again, here I would refer to this to Landa's description of these as strata, and that the linguistic, the biological, and the geological exist as these three different strata. Those strata have an interrelationship to one another. And again, they're primarily distinguished by different speeds. What's interesting, again, about, historically, about both evolution and geology as disciplines that emerged in the 19th century is they both required us to think, and even the current debate about intelligent design, right? But both geology and evolution require us to think about this kind of deep time scale that is very, very difficult to imagine intuitively. And of course, again, the digital tool, genetic algorithms and so on, you see a speeded up evolution, right? So, but I think the time dimension that's implicit in both evolution and geology is an important aspect to that the deep time embedded in both.
The book featured contributions from contemporary artists, architects, fabricators, engineers, but for a book that was very heavy in geological metaphors, I'm not sure if there was contributions by any geologists. And I'm just wondering.
One. There is one, yes.
And I'm just wondering, what do you see the role of the metaphor in landform?
Yeah, that's an important question. I think with really anything. Again, I think for me, I maybe use metaphor as a term, and a metaphor can be simply a metaphor. I think, the case. For example, the argument that somebody like Greg Lynn is not, the argument that he's not using biology as a metaphor, he's actually simulating biological processes. I think that if you can get a little bit below the surface of the metaphor, it's important. I think metaphors, again, at a certain point we're sort of trained to be suspicious of metaphors, again, because the metaphor is also associated with the linguistic. But I'm beginning to be a little bit more. I think the metaphor, to the extent that it can also simply be heuristic, right? It can be something that's useful to the designer to get to a certain place that he or she wouldn't have gotten to by another means. And that doesn't necessarily mean that anybody who views the building has to appeal to the same metaphor. So I think that for me is the difference between the kind of working metaphors, working processes, and working models that I'm proposing here, as opposed to the use of the metaphor, let's say, in the kind of postmodern period, when metaphor was very much about the reception of the building and the meaning and the interpretation of the building, and it was really much more directed at the viewer as opposed to how the project is produced. Frankly, again, this is the interesting thing about architecture, right? Is that architecture exists out there in the world without the support of its author. And so a building may be produced as a result of a certain set of procedures. It doesn't mean that the people using the building are required to understand, buy into, and read those procedures in the final form of the building.
Based on your research, what's the limitations in landform building and what's the next step? Based on your research, do you think what's the limitations in landform building and what's the next step to develop further?
Yeah, sure. Again, part of the motivation of doing the book in the first place, which now, 2009, that's now 3 years ago, was really it was interesting. We did the conference, people here were working on these books, people send me their landform projects. And there's a lot of them, as I said, the softly rounded mound, the aspiration to integrate the built seamlessly with the site and with nature. So I think if anything, there's two things I hope the book would do. First of all, it would make people a little bit suspicious of the kind of, let's say, the sort of cliche of landform building on the one hand, and on the other hand, open up the term beyond the kind of the softly rounded mound in the landscape. But so if there's a limitation that I hope we sort of made visible, it would be that. And yeah, I think in terms of projecting towards the future, it's really opening up the term even further and finding landform strategies that may not look anything like the landform examples that are in the book.
With that, I think we will close the session for today, and you're all invited to reception outside. So thank you.